Okay, people, I'm testing out live streaming on X, where I'm in charge of the control panel. So, if anybody out there can actually see this at the moment, just give me a moment to. Give me a moment to figure out what I'm doing. This will probably lead to an awkward looking intro, but it's a test type scenario. Okay, everybody can hear me and see me. Okay, good. So that test worked well. Um, yeah, so I will be glancing at the comments on Twitter/X, and yeah, I know that's a mouthful, but that tends to be my standard way to reference the platform. Maybe a year from now, I will migrate fully to X, but I don't know. It's just a muscle memory because, for better or worse, Twitter has been like just integrated into my neural makeup, so I can't even force myself to abandon the classic terminology yet. Uh, okay, so thought I would just go over a couple of things. Obviously, the two big news items are the Supreme Court ruling yesterday, which I think a lot of people have misunderstood or misconstrued or misportrayed for a variety of reasons. So I just want to delve into that a little bit. But first, I'll have to, of course, touch on the Dems in disarray narrative, which is often said to be when there are trolls on this platform who will say, "Oh, the media is saying Dems are in disarray again," because they think that the media in general is just too mean to Democrats or insufficiently hostile to Trump and Republicans. So they'll try to mock the perceived or alleged obsession on the part of the media with ginning up divisions or problems for Democrats by saying, "Oh, Dems in disarray again." That's their way of chastising the media, hilariously enough. But I don't know how anybody with a straight face could not contend that Democrats are in disarray at the moment. Um, I don't know how Democrats could be in disarray if this doesn't count as being in disarray. So yesterday, a friend of mine texted me and asked me what odds I would place on Biden withdrawing. And I use the term withdraw deliberately because sometimes people conflate that with Biden resigning, which you don't resign from a presidential campaign. I guess maybe you could use that verb. But resignation, I would use in relation to Biden resigning the presidency. Uh, so I don't use that word for what I'm describing here. Withdrawal, meaning withdraw his candidacy for president, uh, unbound his delegates or release his delegates that he's already accumulated, which is part of why the situation would be so unprecedented. People like to bring up LBJ, but in March of 1968, Lyndon Johnson resigned before very many primaries had even been held. Now, there was a different system in 1968 where primaries were much less binding. They hadn't been as fully or incorporated into the nominating process for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So they were often derided in that period and before as beauty contests, right? Because they weren't at all binding in terms of who the Democratic elected delegates would then vote for at the convention, as evidenced by Hubert Humphrey competing in very few, I think maybe zero primaries. He might have competed in a couple in 1968, but then nonetheless securing the nomination, which is part of what inflamed the protest that famously happened that year outside the convention in Chicago. But because Hubert Humphrey was Lyndon Johnson's vice president and therefore at least was seen to be on board with Lyndon Johnson's policy vis-a-vis Vietnam. But And when Lyndon Johnson withdrew, you had the New Hampshire primary, where Lyndon Johnson only very narrowly defeated a Democratic challenger who was then virtually unknown or largely unknown. He wasn't totally obscure, but didn't have a huge national profile, Eugene McCarthy. And McCarthy, I think in total, when you tabulate the vote results from both the Democratic and Republican primaries, which was seen as acceptable then because of the less binding rules that were attached to the primary process, the final total was that Lyndon Johnson only won by 230 votes in New Hampshire. So Lyndon Johnson withdrew, in part at least, because it became clear that he did not have control over the nomination process, that there was going to be major dissension within the nomination process. And his grasp on the party was becoming tenuous, to say the least. That's not the case for Biden right now. The primaries are over. He literally has already acquired the delegates that are sufficient to secure his nomination, many of whom are bound to him by law. Now, there are potential ways to challenge the constitutionality of these laws. There have been various challenges, but if you go through states like Arizona, New Mexico, and others, there are actually state laws on the books that oblige a delegate who has been elected in a Democratic primary or a Republican primary to, on the first ballot at the convention, vote in accordance with the outcome in the presidential primary election. It's a state law. Now, it's not the most hefty penalty. It's a misdemeanor, I think, in Arizona, as I reminded myself recently. But still, you're potentially inviting criminal liability. Now, in practice, it's probably a little bit unlikely that prosecutors in, say, Arizona would exercise discretion and choose to prosecute a delegate who violated their statutory requirements. But still, you're talking about Democratic Party like apparatchiks and functionaries here. You're not talking about the most risk-taking people in the world, or the people who would probably welcome the idea of voluntarily subjecting themselves to criminal liability. So Biden is in a historically unique situation, for which I can't really see a relevant parallel or an apt parallel, whereby he would be surrendering power when he's in a situation where he already commands control of the party. Yeah, and I'm talking about in a legal, technical, formalistic sense. Now, clearly, as of today, he is at least preliminarily losing control over the party in the sense that he's has rapidly eroding confidence in his ability to persist in a campaign amongst different power brokering factions of the Democratic Party. Now, the metric that I've mostly kept my eye on, not that I haven't been reading everything, but the metric that I've kind of reasoned is the most outcome determinative, most likely, is elected Democratic officials. So not former officials, not strategists, not donors whining, but actual elected Democratic Party officials in the Congress, meaning the House, the Senate, potentially governors' races, maybe some Democratic candidates who aren't office holders at present, but are going to be on the ballot in November, to see what their calculation is. Because that, I think, would be a kind of groundswell, potentially, that would force, or at least force to the extent possible, Biden to reconsider or to entertain withdrawing the candidacy, because whether he's 81 or not, whether he's in a state of cognitive decline or not, and however much that decline might be escalating in its severity, the fact remains that by the books, by the letter of the law, he's entitled to the Democratic nomination, and there's nothing that anybody can do over and above him to really deprive him of that, again, in a technical, formal, legal sense. Now, there can be informal pressure exerted or behind-the-scenes campaigns to exert some kind of will on him, and we see that happening, at least initially, now. But I think one thing, and I did a longer form tweet about this. Was it last night or the night before? I think the night before. That I think people might not be fully appreciating in terms of his apparent obstinacy and his resistance, as far as anybody can discern, to withdrawing, is that to withdraw at this juncture, although not equivalent to a resignation, meaning he's resigning from the presidency, but to withdraw at this point, I think would be just fundamentally humiliating. He gets up on a debate stage for a debate that he and his campaign proposed, by far the earliest debate that was ever held in American history, a one-on-one presidential debate. They decided to vanquish the Commission on Presidential Debates, which would ordinarily hold them through the consent of both of every eligible candidate in the fall, beginning in like late September or early October. And then as a result of that debate performance, he just says, oh, gee, despite my having accumulated all the delegates, and despite my thinking that I'm doing a phenomenal job and I have this historic destiny to save democracy and save Ukraine and save NATO and save Israel and everything, I'm now going to capitulate to people who think wrongly. Remember, this is his narrative, his internal narrative, who think wrongly that I'm not up for the job. That would be a humiliation. That would be an admission that I've been concealing something, that I have been putting on a false appearance as to my competency. So what you see, though, a lot of Democratic pundits or quote insiders or people who now desperately want Biden to withdraw in favor of either coronating Kamala Harris or having an open convention where all the rising stars in the Democratic Party can compete amongst themselves for who will carry the torch. What you see their attack being, and this I'm talking about like Ezra Klein at the New York Times or Thomas Friedman at the New York Times or various people who have made expressed similar sentiments on like MSNBC or CNN. What they'll say is, we are so grateful for Joe Biden. He has such a honorable legacy. He's accomplished so very much. We are thankful to him eternally, but he really ought to consider stepping down for the good of the party, good of the nations. That's a formulation that they use. Now we can debate, and I would debate and contest this flattering depiction that they give of Biden's record, particularly in the foreign policy domain. But they try to essentially devise a formulation in their public appeals that butters Biden up, that inflates his importance, that it seems to be an expression of gratitude, so that therefore they think could give them additional better leverage to actually get him to comply with what they're demanding. But they don't seem to have considered that however much they want to butter him up, however many platitudes they want to rattle off about how fantastic a job he's done and what a service to his country he's been, it still would be a fundamentally humiliating act for him to essentially withdraw under duress, right? Because it's not as if he's had, as far as we know, a genuinely debilitating enough medical episode that he would be literally physically incapacitated from carrying on. People just observe that he's had an accelerating cognitive depreciation, or that he's descended to like some accelerated state of cognitive impairment. So it's not like you could say, "Oh, you know what? I unexpectedly had a sudden medical event, and therefore I'm going to honorably withdraw." No, he would have to be resigning himself, in the more informal sense, to this chorus of demands that have been building up, that he accede to pressure. And when you're the president, not to psychoanalyze too much, because that can always be a dangerous and usually pretty annoying approach that people take to evaluating these events. When you're the president, you're surrounded by people day in and day out who tell you how phenomenal of a job that you're doing, how right you are. You genuinely are the most powerful person probably in the country, or even the world, arguably, however you want to necessarily rank the power of the presidency. It's way up there in human history as in terms of the power wielded by one person. Um, so to just bow down and accept that your critics are right, the people who are flailing you are right, and therefore you are going to willingly relinquish those awesome powers, even though you think that you still have this historic destiny, that you're totally equipped for the job. I just think that it's questionable whether any president could be forced to, or kind of coerced or pressured into acceding or capitulating under those circumstances. I don't even think you have to be have a particularly stubborn personality style. Although I think anybody who becomes president has to have some personality traits where they're kind of bullish and you might say stubborn, or self-flattering, self-promotional. That's hard to really say. Now, another aspect of this is, I think that if, let's say, he were to withdraw tomorrow, okay? Let's say that Biden were to withdraw his candidacy tomorrow. I think if he has any sense of his historic legacy, which I don't see how he couldn't, even in his diminished cognitive state, what he has to be thinking is, or what I think would be the case, whether or not he's thinking of it, is that he would necessarily then be put into this category of ignominious presidential downfalls, meaning people who, through force of circumstance or through, again, the pressure that was inflicted on them, had to relinquish power under duress. And that would include Richard Nixon. Of course, it's not a perfectly analogous situation. You could rarely find any historical parallel that is perfectly analogous. But Richard Nixon ended up being, quote unquote, forced to resign because he was approached by members of his own party, led by Barry Goldwater, who was a senator, who was the 1964 nominee for president for the Republicans, and whose memoir I mostly have read recently, who had to be dispatched to the White House to tell Nixon not to resign, although Goldwater said in his memoir that he would have told Nixon to resign if it had just been him in a one-on-one meeting, because he was so fed up with what he saw as Nixon's duplicity. But it was a group of congressional leaders led by Goldwater who didn't outright tell him to resign, but told him that his support within the Republican House and Senate caucuses had effectively evaporated to the point where he could probably be successfully impeached and then convicted in the Senate. So that's an example of a president resigning under duress. And what did Nixon's historical reputation come? It's defined by his resignation. Glasses became crooked. Now, I'm not saying that you can't have alternative views as to the nature of Watergate or whatever led to Nixon's resignation or what his legacy ought to be properly understood as. But still, obviously, for him to have resigned and be the first president in history at that point to ever resign, still is the first and only. Obviously, that was going to be a defining aspect of his quote legacy. And I think the same would be true of Biden. Again, stipulating that there are many differences between the circumstances of Biden today and the circumstances of Nixon in 1974, Biden would still be the first president who withdrew under these circumstances. So does he want that to be a defining part of his legacy? I don't know. Can't get in his head. I just think that that's a factor that has to be operative, and I think probably more so than a lot of the Dem insiders have acknowledged, because a lot of them now are in a mode where they're doing everything that they can, or they're making a major effort to enjoin or exhort Biden to withdraw. So they're couching their appeals in this, flattering or praiseworthy language, where they're proclaiming their undying gratitude for Biden, but then also throwing in that, gee whiz, Joe, you might want to consider dropping out, which it's kind of like a dagger in the heart. You would almost, I think, maybe even want them to be more brutal about it, rather than trying to pretend or act like they're killing him with kindness. Now, I don't necessarily doubt that there are lots of Democrats who have a fond feeling toward Biden and are only saying this stuff, reluctantly. But I don't know. It's just hard for me to believe that any president or anybody in a position of high political office would, welcome and be soothed by a call for their withdrawal /and/or resignation, just because it's framed in a way that is intended to be solicitous of them. Now, speaking of Lyndon Johnson, who, as I mentioned before, withdrew after the New Hampshire primary, the New Hampshire primary of 2024 is actually underappreciated as a forerunner or a harbinger of what we're seeing unfold now. So there was a very minor challenger, as people might recall, Dean Phillips, the congressman from Minnesota, who did run in the Democratic primaries, or at least some of them. He was on the ballot in New Hampshire. And Dean Phillips declared his candidacy in October of last year, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was October. After, according to Dean Phillips, he had tried to lobby other more widely known Democratic Party officials in the country, like I believe Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, so same state. I think he claimed that he tried to appeal to Gretchen Whitmer. I think he claimed he tried to appeal to J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, to launch their own campaigns. And of course, they all resisted that, because who wants to be in a perilous situation where they're challenging the incumbent president? So Dean Phillips ran himself. And people should go back and take a look. I'm going to actually do a piece, I think, where I'm going to reference some of this just for posterity. People should take a look at what was done to the New Hampshire primary this year by the Democratic National Committee, which, unlike when many of the times that people refer to like this nefarious, malevolent influence of the DNC, as though it's this all-consuming, omnipotent force, the DNC does mean the Democratic National Committee. People sometimes invoke the initials DNC to refer to other stuff. I'm actually talking about the entity, the Democratic National Committee. What they did under effectively the control of Biden was neuter and an attempt to delegitimize the New Hampshire primary, which has a long tradition of being the first in the nation primary going back 100 plus years. Even back in the mid and early 20th century, when many states did not even hold preference primaries, New Hampshire did. So there was a tradition of it. And it's actually enshrined in New Hampshire state law that they must hold the first presidential primary. But Biden wanted the schedule totally overturned in 2024. And I think they started the efforts to accomplish that as far back as like 2021, 2022, where they wanted South Carolina to go first. So what happened was Biden wasn't even a formal candidate in the New Hampshire primary. He was on the ballot. But then they tried to do an end run thing, meaning Biden and his surrogates and his campaign apparatus, where they launched this write-in Biden campaign. So he wasn't actually on the ballot, but there was a push to get him written in. And he wasn't on the ballot because they weren't going to recognize the delegates from New Hampshire because they had violated DNC rules, even though the DNC did this whole imposition on New Hampshire that flew in the face of what the tradition had been in terms of the placement of the New Hampshire primary. So the Republicans, as you might recall, they recognized the New Hampshire primary as normal. Trump won this year, of course, but Biden was on the ballot. And that New Hampshire was going to be Dean Phillips' major push to somehow demonstrate that he had sufficient support to mount a legitimate challenge to Biden, but Dean Phillips kind of flopped on that. But why did Biden do that? Why were they so determined to effectively disenfranchise New Hampshire Democratic primary voters by refusing to acknowledge, or by attempt? And when I say disenfranchise, the DNC would send like threat letters to the state Democratic Party in New Hampshire. It did send a threat letter to the state Democratic Party in New Hampshire, warning them that they must not present the New Hampshire primary as a legitimate electoral contest. So they were basically saying, look, Democratic Party of New Hampshire, you must tell Democrats in your state not to participate in the Democratic primary. And this was doubly deceptive or conniving, because they simultaneously had this, ostensibly outside effort through a super PAC to encourage Democrats or Democratic primary voters to write in Biden. But why did he want to delegitimize New Hampshire in the first place? Well, I would bet you that Biden is familiar with a man by the name of Lyndon Baines Johnson, whose most immediate impetus for his own withdrawal in 1968 was his lackluster performance in the New Hampshire Democratic primary. And Biden knew that he could rely on South Carolina for a more robust vote, just given the differences in that electorate. Southern, black, heavy, much more probably loyally Democratic in terms of just not really rocking the boat in terms of who the Democratic Party kind of puts in front of them. Whereas in New Hampshire, there's a slightly more, a slightly greater ethos of party disloyalty, right? I mean, there was, and this probably applies to both parties to some degree. Like Pat Buchanan overperformed in New Hampshire against George H.W. Bush in 1992. John McCain famously won over the anointed Republican nominee in the 2000 cycle, George W. Bush. And so it's slightly less the case for Democrats, but you see my point. But in addition to that, what the New Hampshire primary rigging effectively demonstrated was that even though there was no major primary challenger, the Biden campaign and Democratic National Committee were still very much determined to craft or maneuver or tailor the Democratic primaries to maximally give Biden a glide path to an uncontested nomination. Because if there had been a contested primary, maybe even to the point where Biden was required to participate in debates, it seems rather likely that Biden's cognitive deficiencies probably would have been brought to bear. So for Democratic quote insiders and donors and pundits who now want to profess shock that Biden was so bad on Thursday last week, as though it was just a sudden burst of epiphany that they all collectively underwent. Did you follow what happened in the nominal Democratic primaries this year? Did you notice that even though dating back to 2023, perhaps even earlier, huge segments of Democratic voters, not to mention voters writ large in the electorate, were saying unambiguously that they did not want Biden to be the nominee, largely because they viewed his age as a fully understandable impediment. So now we have a flood of stories coming out. There was a big one in the New York Times that everybody was going crazy over about Biden having spotty performances in international meetings, or administration officials and others are saying on background that they at times, especially over the past several months, have been troubled by his subpar acuity. That's all well and good. Of course, that was already observable for anybody who was not just instinctively inclined to believe ridiculous White House spin or Democratic mainline functionary spin about how when he had all these moments that were clipped out, yes, by Republicans, sometimes they were in fact exaggerated by these Republican, X accounts or the RNC or whomever. But in totality, it was still impossible to deny that he wasn't undergoing a decline. But that's obvious. That almost goes without saying. I'm more pointing to the fact, pointing to how they preemptively neutered and undercut the Democratic primary process this year to basically give Biden like I said, a glide path to the nomination without anybody really being able to subject him to rigorous scrutiny. Now, that's not necessarily unusual for a Democratic or Republican incumbent president. There hasn't been a contested primary for an incumbent president now in several decades, and there's like this taboo against it because there's just this kind of folk wisdom that if a incumbent president gets challenged in a primary, that means that is my audio still on? I kind of fumbled around with my microphone for a second. Hopefully. But now I lost my train of thought. Now I'm like Joe Biden. Oh, but there's this I think unexamined taboo okay, people hear me good. There's this unexamined kind of folk wisdom-y taboo in Republican and especially Democratic circles that just assumes that it's inherently bad and damaging to the incumbent if that incumbent is faced with a primary challenge. And there are three main election cycles that they'll point to. Okay, so 1976, Gerald Ford, the incumbent president who was appointed vice president, that became president upon Nixon's resignation, faced a primary challenge that was extremely robust from Ronald Reagan. Ford kind of barely won. Reagan endorsed him at the convention. And by the way, historical footnote: people may not know this. Reagan offered Gerald Ford the vice presidency in 1980. So there was an offer on the table for Gerald Ford to become vice president again, and Ford declined that, and George H.W. Bush was the victor. Not particularly relevant here, but just a curious historical fun fact that people might not have known, but it's true. So in 1976, Gerald Ford faces a contentious primary and then loses in the general election to Jimmy Carter. 1980, Jimmy Carter is the incumbent president, faces a primary challenge from Ted Kennedy in the Democratic primary, which was actually not as robust as might have been assumed given the Kennedy family legacy, but it was enough where it was a thorn in his side, right? But Carter fairly easily still managed to secure the nomination, but then still lost in 1980 against Reagan. And then 1992, Pat Buchanan runs in the Republican Party against primary against George H.W. Bush. Overperforms, but doesn't even win that many delegates in the grand scheme of things. Nowhere near the amount that Reagan won in 76. But then George H.W. Bush then, of course, goes on to lose re-election to Bill Clinton. So you have a sample size of 3, really, in modern times. Because you also got to recall there haven't been nationwide primaries, really, since 1972, maybe 1968, but not really. 72 was when reform started to accelerate that basically incentivized states to start holding public primary elections, whereas in the past there had been, there might be insular party caucuses and the smoke-filled room cliche. But you have a very limited sample size of election cycles in which an incumbent was allegedly so damaged by a primary challenge that they went on to lose the general election. Now, I think it's even doubtful how much stock you can put in the fact of them having a primary challenge as a causative factor in subsequently losing the general election, but people just kind of, glom everything together in their historical memories, and that has led to this long-standing taboo, at least among elite insidery types. The general public doesn't have any real working knowledge or memory of this stuff. But that's led to the taboo where, of course, under no circumstances can you have a primary, because it'll be lethal to the incumbent, and we can't have that, especially with Donald Trump on the horizon, and he's going to destroy democracy, and he's a fascist, and he's a Nazi, blah, 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 blah. He's an insurrectionist, he's a convicted felon, etc. But it's extraordinarily unclear and just kind of folk wisdom, folk science, folk something that the dynamics. Let's even grant, for the sake of argument, which I don't necessarily even concede, but let's just grant that you could justifiably say that the primary challenges in those 3 races from decades ago were causative in leading to the incumbent losing re-election. On what basis can you just kind of casually assume that the dynamics from 1976, 1980, and 1992 could just be easily and neatly transplanted onto 2024, and that's why you can't have a contested primary? So I'm talking about, and if that was the calculus in 2024, that's in large part what led to major Democratic figures not even entertaining the idea of running in a contested primary against Biden. So I'm talking about governors, Newsom, maybe a senator here and there, anybody with any semblance of a national profile beyond that of Dean Phillips, who was virtually unknown, who might have otherwise considered running in 2024, but calculated that it was not in their or the party's whatever interest because of this incumbency damaging effect that they just baselessly assume must be true in 2024 because it was, theoretically, arguably true several decades ago. So they shot themselves in the foot, meaning the Democratic Party collectively, the elites, the tastemakers, the elected officials, strategists, whomever. Because if there had been a contested primary this time around, then you might have a situation where Biden could face a real electoral challenge, lose a decent number of delegates. He actually has lost some in this current cycle. He's only won about 99%. So there's about 1% of delegates who are now bound to uncommitted. And those were the pro-Palestine activists who got uncommitted on some state ballots. I personally voted for uncommitted in New Jersey. And New Jersey has awarded 2 delegates to uncommitted. So there will be 2 delegates at the Democratic National Convention representing uncommitted and on behalf of, pro-Palestine activists. Not that I necessarily associate myself with every rhetorical flourish that the pro-Palestine activists tend to traffic in. I don't make a habit of running around screaming genocide, in part because I reject the premise of the logical coherence of the concept of genocide, but we can save that for another time. But the point is that they're having a contested primary, and let's say Biden underperforms, which is probably likely. Obviously, this is all counterfactual now. But if he had even 50% performance that was as bad in a primary debate as was his performance last week, maybe it could have been a real race. Now, it's also plausible, probably probable, that Biden could have nonetheless won the primary overall. But you could have had a situation maybe where before he had secured all the delegates, or when discontent within the Democratic Party had been made apparent through electoral outcomes, then maybe that could have provided a scenario where Biden would have been forced to reevaluate beyond this panicked 11th hour pressure campaign that we see now, where nobody has a leg to stand on in terms of having delegates to that are not bound to Biden. That wasn't a very artful way of putting it. Nobody has a leg to stand on in the Democratic Party in terms of making a case to Biden that he lacks Democratic or popular legitimacy. Biden has that argument. Biden can say, look, folks, look, fellas, I've got the delegates. He does. LBJ didn't in March 1968. So people who don't understand that distinction when they draw that comparison are making a somewhat embarrassing error. Obviously there were lots of clips throughout the years, especially maybe the past couple months, of Biden exhibiting clear signs of diminishment. But I guess what I'm trying to point to is the collective posture of the Democratic Party well before this last debate, going back a year and a half, where they just kind of politely said, yeah, we're all going to defer to the big man. Like in that email that came out, save 10% for the big man or whatever it was. Yeah, we're all going to defer to the big man. He's our cherished, beloved incumbent. Sure, he might be 81, and sure, he might be running to be president when he's 86, but there's nothing we can do. We're just, we're just kind of somehow metaphysically required to pave the way for his seamless renomination. You have Democrats now like Jamie Raskin, who I did think in an interview tonight on MSNBC seemed to more clearly allude than he has before that there's some sub rosa effort among at least a faction of House Democrats to come up with a plan to potentially, I don't know what they're going to do exactly, maybe have a meeting at the White House or request one and tell Biden, look, the jig is up and you have to go. I don't know what they're going to do exactly, but they said that the serious conversations are happening. And Jamie Raskin loves to brag that shows the Democratic Party is a very healthy party. It's not just a top-down authoritarian death cult like the Republican Party. Now, I'm not defending the Republican Party in the slightest. There is a massive cult of personality around Trump, but you can't try and claim that Trump has no democratic legitimacy in terms of popular voter support within the Republican Party. But the Democrats have no claim to that either, given how frozen they were, or how just meekly deferential they were to just ill-considered, unexamined conventional wisdom about this obvious need to ensure that Biden could be president again until age 86. Anybody can go on Wikipedia and look at his age. They could have done that in mid 2023. It wasn't a mystery. Even then, obviously, he was still exhibiting certain signs of cognitive decline. He was even exhibiting signs in 2020, but it was not at the point that it's at now. So for Democrats to say, "Oh, look, we're such a healthy party that we waited for all the primaries to be over for Biden to be awarded all the delegates, and then when there's one sudden debate bad debate appearance, we have a whole frenzy and meltdown, and we're going to do something by having serious conversations. Conversations among who? Fellow Democratic insiders and functionaries and elites. They're not having quote conversations with voters. That quote conversation would have occurred if there were an actual primary, which there wasn't. So in sum, my thesis for this stream in terms of the Biden developments is that the damage was done. They shot themselves in the foot. They entered into this delusion or this, again, just bizarre fugue state regarding Biden's future prospects long ago. So, if any of them try to favorably contrast themselves with the Republican Party, I mean, and by that, I'm talking about the few Democrats who have now come out and publicly voiced, quote, concerns. That contrast is not anywhere near as favorable for them as they might want to make it out to be. Not to mention that, Jamie Raskin was on this interview and said the number one priority, and Representative Jerry Connolly said the same thing. Our number one priority and what all Democrats are unified behind and what we're all going to be extremely vigorous in our pursuit of is making sure that Donald Trump does not become president. Okay, fine. I get that. There's an election coming up. You don't like Donald Trump. Shocking news. But how about his competency to perform the job now? Also, in this forthcoming piece I'm going to have, do you know how many minutes it's estimated that a president has to decide whether to launch nuclear weapons in the event of some acute crisis, such as nuclear weapons are flying at the United States or whatever else? As few as 6 minutes, the max is, according to a Congressional Research Service report from just May of this year, the maximum is 10 minutes. Does anybody, Jamie Raskin, and even Lloyd Doggett, who came out and said that he was the first member of Congress, Democrat, to say that Biden should stand down today, do they can they, with a straight face, tell us that as of July of 2024, they are unwaveringly, sublimely confident in Joe Biden's ability to summon the mental dexterity that would be required to make an extremely high pressure, like unfathomably high pressure, almost, near split-second decision with life and death, possibly for all of humanity, resting on his shoulders, that Biden would be able to do that to the satisfaction of any rational individual. I can't believe that they would try to maintain that. Now, they might attempt to, but I can't believe that anybody would actually believe that. Much less would Biden be able to make that 6-minute decision, rustle out of bed at 3 a.m. at age 86? I mean, that's just a joke, okay? So even if Biden were to withdraw, right? Let's say he withdraws tomorrow. How are Democrats going to disabuse anybody's accurate perception that Biden is drastically ill-equipped to perform the basic duties of his job now? and he's going to be in office no matter what. I just got a thumbs up on my screen. I don't even know where that came from. So I'm learning on the job here. Thank you for that, though, I guess. How is anybody actually? When I have like graphics that just flash on my screen, I lose my train of thought. That's one of the perils of live streaming. Um, at the very least, Biden is constitutionally entitled to remain president until February. So let's count how many months that is: July to August, August, September, September, October, October, November. So about 6 months, Biden is in office. Whether he wins or loses the election, whether he stands down from his campaign now, unless he resigns, which again would put him in Nixon territory as the only other president who resigned office, Biden's going to be in office for at least 6 months. More than 6 months, actually. Like 6.5 months. So if the recent leaks are to be believed, people are whispering to the New York Times and NBC News and other places that Biden has visibly undergone an accelerated decline within just the past few months. They say this isn't the Joe Biden that we saw 6 months ago. So if he has declined that drastically in 6 months, which I don't really buy, I mean, he must have declined somewhat. The aging process barrels forward. But I wonder whether it really is as dramatic just in these past couple months as people try to suggest now. Although who knows? It's possible. I mean, the stresses of the job probably accelerate aging for any president, and you can see that by the before and after photos of like George W. Bush or Barack Obama or Reagan or whomever, where they have all gray, their hair's all gray and they look wrinkled and slightly more haggard. Before and after the presidency, that appears, at least, I mean, and it's hard to say with any certainty, but that appears maybe somewhat marginally beyond just the normal course of the aging process. But if he has gone rapidly accelerated decline just in the past 6 months, and he has 6 months to go, then wouldn't you expect that process to accelerate further? So I think another conundrum of these Democratic insiders who are now, wailing for Biden to leave, to withdraw his candidacy, is that that's going to still be an albatross, even for a hypothetical nominee, Kamala Harris, Whitmer, whomever, Newsom. Wouldn't that still rightly, perfectly justifiably, be an albatross around the neck of any Democratic candidate where they have to explain how it is that they can remain confident in Biden's ability to continue to do the job just in the course of the next 6 months? Or in other words, the question to put to them, that should be put to them, is if he couldn't withstand the rigors of a debate or a presidential campaign, despite assuring the public for months ahead of time that he could, how can he withstand the rigors of the presidency? With multiple wars going on, nuclear brinksmanship in Ukraine, a fiasco, a never-ending fiasco with Israel. I don't see what the good answer to that question is. Now, there's no good answer really for Democrats in terms of how they could salvage this situation. But that's just one thing that I haven't really seen many Democratic insiders even try to grapple with, because they're stuck in this mode where they have to be extra flattering and extra complimentary of Biden and extol how wonderful his record and how wonderful his record is and how grateful they are for his presidency and what a storied legacy he has in public life. So that I think that seems to have occluded for them the idea that maybe he's not equipped to be in office right now. So it's just, man, it's a mess. I'm going to go myself on the 4th of July to some of these 4th of July parades that politicians love to gland hand at and smile at and, their chest puffed and walk around like they own the place at. And I'm going to ask a Democrat. I'm not even going to name who it is right now. I want it to be a secret. For his or her thoughts on Biden's not just continued ability to wage a re-election campaign, but ability to remain in office. Because I want to hear at least one of them attempt to reconcile those competing considerations as to if he can't run again, how could he remain in office now? It doesn't make sense. Oh, we're just going to hope, we're going to, cross our fingers and hope for the best for the next 6 months. Well, sorry. 5 months from now, he's still the one who has sole authority over the nuclear launch codes. And the fact that that's not even really brought up in these frenzied discussions of his fitness, it's just a total skewing of priorities, which is nothing new, of course, for the punditocracy or the professional political class. Okay, I'm going to go through some comments, I think, and then I'll go to a little some words on the immunity ruling. So let's see. How do you give a thumbs up on the screen? Ask someone. I'm not sure. I'm learning on the fly here. I have not done a live stream on X yet. Andrew, my one of my loyalist little lackeys, says, if the Dems can get Biden to resign after the convention, I heard the DNC directly picks the candidate, not the delegates. That is true. So that's another scenario. That would be interesting. So let's say after the convention, 2 weeks after the convention, Biden dies, or for that matter, 2 weeks after the convention, Trump dies. Obviously, the RNC and the DNC, meaning the national committees, have bylaws that provide for a process in the extreme scenario that the nominee is literally incapacitated and cannot run, whether by death or something to that effect. So I mean, again, we're in unprecedented territory here, but yeah, I have, I'm one of these weirdos who actually has read the DNC bylaws and such, and I don't have the wording in front of me. You know what? I'm going to pull that up. Let's see. I was going to do screen sharing on this, but then I got some notification from StreamYard, which suggested that it might be a more involved process that I was willing to tolerate for the moment. It's such a long and boring document that I'm not going to be able to find it immediately, but I'll look it up after the stream. But yeah, that's another interesting scenario. But that would make it so that the Democratic National Committee, like the board or the literal, not convention delegates, their job is complete once the convention is over. They have no power at that point. Then it would fall to the executive committee and such of the Democratic National Committee to choose to arrive at a process whereby a replacement could be named. So that's another potential scenario. Who knows? Somebody asks, will Dems sub in RFK Jr.? Sorry if I eye rolled, but you're going to get an eye roll answer. He says, a fan accepting the Israel lobby pocket he's in and lack of actual anti-establishment courage seems to me their interests, Dems and RFK campaign, now converge as Biden unviable. The answer is no. There was virtually zero chance. You can't put anything at zero. I'm going to say a 0.01% chance that Dems sub in RFK Jr. Remember, let's be a little precise about what we're referring to. It's not just Democrats writ large, although I don't even think Democrats writ large would support that. I mean, just ordinary rank and file Democratic voters and such. We're talking about party functionaries, people who are just mainline professional Democrats from every state who, in the event that Biden were no longer available, of course, their immediate desire would be for somebody who reflects the mainline Democratic consensus sentiments of Biden, or the political profile of Biden. RFK doesn't do that. He abandoned his Democratic primary campaign last fall and started running as an independent because he wants to stake out this countervailing position relative to the two major parties. And I do notice that he's become a bit more vehement now and even attacking Trump, whereas in the past, especially when he was running as a Democrat, and he was being, ass kissed on conservative media, he kind of hedged on Trump, or he wouldn't go after him as aggressively. Now, I haven't watched every RFK dopey podcast appearance, but that was just my general sense. And I feel like there's a bit of a change in tone on that score, which you would expect because he's, in theory, running against both Trump and Biden. Now, if the Democratic, if all 3,900 something Democratic delegates collectively came to RFK and offered him the nomination on a platter, would he accept it? Who wouldn't? I would accept it. Anybody would accept it, I think, who has any kind of aspiration to hold high office. And I have seen that RFK has addressed this and said that he would be open to discussions to accept it, but there's just no viable chance of that at all. Like, why would they pick? Why would professional Democratic functionaries, like party vice chairs of Illinois or DNC staff secretaries from Virginia or something, why would they pick? Could you imagine those types of people, maybe getting a brainworm like RFK and saying, "Oh yeah, now we're gonna just abandon everything that we've previously believed about this guy and about the Democratic Party, and pass over Kamala Harris or J.B. Pritzker or Gretchen Whitmer or Gavin Newsom or Wes Moore or any of these other mainline Democratic options for RFK Jr., who they think of as a saboteur and as a crazy person and as a tarnisher of the storied Kennedy family legacy." No, that makes no sense. Let's see. I'm switching back and forth between my comment streams on X and also on StreamYard. I'm not sure if they're totally in sync. Anyway, okay, so yeah, that's it for now, unless anybody has any additional thoughts. I just want to go through a few thoughts on the Supreme Court immunity ruling. Oh, and my lamp just fell. That's embarrassing. I have such a tangle of wires because behind my computer, I only have a power outlet that's inconveniently far. And so I have to have like a whole Rube Goldberg machine set up to power my light and my computer and everything. So yeah, there's always a chance that I might have just things crashing around me. So on the Supreme Court ruling, I read the whole thing. I read all 119 pages. And I noticed that there were, of course, this is nothing new for social media or the media in general, because they're now like social media and just regular media are basically one and the same in a lot of ways. But how were people issuing these furious denunciations or statements of praise for the Supreme Court ruling when they literally physically could not have read it by the time that they were rattling off these passionate statements? Maybe I'm old-fashioned, or maybe I'm, quaint. But I do think that, especially for a landmark Supreme Court decision, where every sentence, every word choice potentially is extremely consequential, maybe you want to consider reading it first, or at least skimming it, before you start pontificating for the general public about what's contained therein, or what the implications are, or who it benefits or who it hurts. So I did something wild and actually read all of it, and including the dissents. And here's how I would summarize it. I had a couple of posts along these lines. Okay, number one, it is, of course, true that between 1789 When George Washington strode into office as our nation's first president, you may know that lots of stuff is named after him, like the nation's capital, like the state of Washington, like one of the elementary schools in my hometown. Lots of stuff named after Washington. Lots of streets, etc. Between 1789 and 2023, somebody just distracted me by saying, "Read out my chest hair comment, please." Okay, I'll do that. I'm not ashamed if I can find it. Somebody says, the return of the rug. Yeah. People are always commenting on my facial and body hair. Look, it's a gift that I was given by my genetics. So I've just come to embrace it. And, just a funny, no. Okay. So growing up, right, I just assumed that my dad was just the hairiest person on earth. Couldn't see how anybody could possibly be any hairier than him. And sure enough, I ended up being hairier than him. So I really won the genetic lottery there. It's not pretty, but there you have it. So between 1789 and 2023, presidents enjoyed what I would call functional immunity or de facto immunity or informal immunity from criminal liability, right? In the 70s, the Supreme Court accorded presidents some degree of civil immunity. So police officers have qualified immunity. It's called for that, but that's nothing to do with their criminal liability. Like, of course, police officers don't often get indicted for mowing somebody down in their apartment and whatnot. But they theoretically could. There's no barrier in the law that would prevent them from getting indicted if they committed certain criminal conduct and then a prosecutor chose to indict them. That just doesn't happen in practice much of the time. So the police officers they're insulated from civil liability. I mean, they can't be sued in most cases or many cases. Obviously, there's always debate over the extent to which qualified immunity does insulate them from civil liability. But to the extent that qualified immunity exists for police officers, it's exclusively for civil liability, meaning from being sued or having to pay damages. Not from being sued, but being liable for civil damages. There has been no generalized criminal immunity for anyone unless somebody can find some obscure precedent that I'm missing in the law history books somewhere. There's been no generalized criminal immunity for anyone until yesterday. Okay, now there is criminal immunity in certain narrow instances for other people, like members of Congress. There's a clause in the Constitution, in the text, not requiring anybody's interpretation. It's in the literal text, which does afford members of Congress, under what's called the speech and debate clause, criminal immunity for certain acts that they might take when engaged in debate or when engaged in certain forms of official conduct, so even when traveling to and from the Capitol. And there are variations of that actually for state legislators, depending on the state. But that's not a generalized according of criminal immunity to anywhere near the extent that was just done yesterday. So again, 1789, 2023, presidents by custom, by social and cultural mores, by maybe even prosecutorial discretion, by just long-standing informal assumption, had not been subject to criminal liability for their acts taken in office and even arguably out of office. But what happened yesterday is new. Now, people who try to downplay the significance of this ruling will argue that, oh no, this has always existed. Nothing has changed. Well, no, something has changed. What had previously been functional immunity or informal immunity now has the force of law behind it and has been decreed by the Supreme Court and is therefore going to get embedded into the fabric of American governance. Now, I'm not even saying that I oppose the ruling necessarily because I don't really even think in those terms. Do I oppose or support a Supreme Court ruling? I mean, I'm not. It's not. I'm not at a basketball game. I'm just trying to evaluate the significance or the implications of the ruling. And I do notice that there are two kind of partisan interpretations that have become prominent. Number one, of course, you have shrieking liberals, many of whom or most of whom couldn't have possibly even begun to read the decision yesterday, who were immediately shrieking that this is tyranny, this is the king replacing the president, which, by the way, would also apply to Joe Biden right now, to the extent that he's aware, or any future Democrat. Are saying that they use it to bolster their democracy is under attack line, and then try to use that to fuel the case against Trump. Blah 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 blah. You can recite it all in your sleep. But likewise, there was an immediate reflexive downplaying of the significance of the decision by MAGAs or Trump Republicans or pro-Trump whoever, because most of them, understandably, if you're a partisan supporter of Trump, you're going to welcome and celebrate any court ruling that would seem to, in the short term, advantage Trump. And this does, in the short term, advantage Trump. The January 6th election interference, Jack Smith investigation, that's indefinitely delayed at this point. Even if Jack Smith could come up with a case that elements of what Trump was charged with in that indictment don't fall under the immunity protections that were prescribed by the Supreme Court, that would take like a year or something to get sorted out in litigation. That's over, effectively. And Trump is even invoking this ruling to challenge his convictions in the Manhattan trial. And I think, given the expansiveness of what the Supreme Court declared, he probably has a reasonably good shot at getting those convictions thrown out. Now, you might say to yourself, how could that be? Making hush money payments, and I hate that term, hush money, but entering into his business records payments for Michael Cohen, his personal attorney, how could that be an official action? And I thought that what the Supreme Court laid out is that there are several categories of presidential conduct that it was immunizing. Number one are core constitutional powers, right? So that they granted absolute immunity. And those are powers that are squarely defined as in the constitutional ambit of a president under Article 2. So issuing the pardon power, absolute. Vetoing legislation, absolute. Making appointments or terminating federal appointees, absolute. That is all unambiguously within the president's Article 2 powers, and therefore is absolutely immunized. But then they created this secondary category for presumptive immunity. So it's different than absolute immunity, but it therefore makes any official action of the president, which is much less concretely defined, presumptively immune from any criminal liability. And that includes Trump communicating to, actually, Amy Coney Barrett partially dissented from this part of it. That includes Trump communicating with state legislators after the 2020 election and complaining that they ought to discard the election results and whatnot. I mean, so that could be an official action because it's seen as an official action for the president to communicate what he regards as in the public interest, which could be anything. So that's all presumptively immunized. And then, which means that lower courts would have to review any claim that one of those official actions is subject to criminal liability, and the burden would be on the complainant to establish, to prove, not on the defendant potentially, which would be the president, but on the complainant. The burden would be on them to prove that their allegation of an official act constituting criminal conduct would not unduly impinge on or impair the exercise of the president's Article 2 powers. And, you could have a million, legal seminars on that and nobody would ever agree. So it's incredibly expansive. And it should also be noted, okay, yes, I'm aware of this. I covered it at the time. I've read through every indictment and the associated legal commentaries. I don't need to be reminded that this whole process was instigated by Jack Smith and the DOJ, who were on a crusade of vengeance to prosecute Trump for whatever they could. They threw everything at the wall and saw to see what sticks. And that was also the case in the Manhattan prosecution, the Atlanta, Georgia prosecution, and then the two Jack Smith prosecutions. I've been critical of all of them. And I recognize that I therefore, obviously recognize that the initial instigator of this whole Supreme Court review process was the DOJ, which chose to upheave all existing precedent and charge a former president with criminal offenses and ridiculous criminal offenses, like violated the Espionage Act with the Mar-a-Lago document stuff, which is not an issue here. And even but what was an issue here was the January 6th stuff. And Trump was charged with violating a Civil War era civil rights statute, conspiracy against rights, as though he were leading an insurrection to secede from the Union or something. So I'm fully on board and had been vocal about it and have written about it, that the special counsel's office set the wheel in motion here for unprecedented outcomes to follow. And they got it because the Supreme Court, the majority freely acknowledged in the majority ruling that there's really no pertinent precedent for them to draw upon in terms of formulating this now officially codified immunity for the president. So they had to kind of come up with the contours of it, mostly out of thin air. Obviously, they invoke certain tangential precedents and certain historical precursors, but in terms of an actual set of straightforward, tangible precedents, there were none, so they created them. And so, whereas before the president had enjoyed informal immunity enforced by custom, now he has formal immunity enforced by law for a very wide range of potential actions that could conceivably include virtually any action he takes, including signing off on checks to in his corporate ledgers to pay his personal attorney, which is what happened in the Michael Cohen Manhattan Stormy Daniels case, because Trump was charged with so many counts for that case because the reimbursements that he issued monthly to Cohen happened all throughout 2017, February 2017 to December of 2017. Each month he issued a reimbursement. And so he was president at the time. Now, how could you argue that those were official acts and therefore eligible for immunity under the Supreme Court's new ruling? Well, the Trump lawyers are obviously going to make a case for that. And I can anticipate that, they could say that Trump was conferring with administration officials or people in the White House as to how to handle it, how to handle his reimbursement procedure. And he utilized White House resources, which are official, quote unquote. And I'm sure there's an argument that can be ginned up. It might even work. And so but remove yourself, attempt, I know it's difficult, but at least try for a moment to extricate yourself from the monomaniacal, myopic, Trump-centered view of everything. And I admit that at times I fall prey to that. But just try to even just disregard Trump for a moment. Pretend like he never existed. Again, impossible. Just try. It's impossible not to argue that the terms of what the majority ruled, in terms of how this new presidential immunity is defined, I don't see how anybody could possibly argue that it's not a massive expansion of executive power. And executive power, especially since World War II, has been growing and growing and growing, largely unchecked, and largely because I have to say, the conservative legal community, and the Supreme Court is 6-3 dominated by, if you want to call them conservatives, they're at least Republican appointees. They have been usually the most deferential to executive power. That went to overdrive under Bush. Now, there are always some exceptions or nuances there, but in the main, these more conservative judicial figures have often ruled in a way that enhanced and fortified and expanded executive authority, which had already kind of made the presidency this quasi monarchical office. So that's, I don't see how anybody can dispute that that's what this ruling entails. Does that mean I therefore denied that the whole impetus for the ruling was the work of Jack Smith and the DOJ? No, of course I don't deny that. But one thing leads to another, and this precedent that's now been newly established will long outlive Trump, Biden, or anybody. So, just imagine how you would, let's say you're a MAGA type, right? President AOC, President Cesar Chavez Jr., President Che Guevara Jr., whoever. Imagine like some big left-wing villain that you hate in the 10 years, 20 years down the line. Doesn't just enjoy informal immunity anymore, but now has embedded into the fabric of the government over which he or she presides this official immunity, where they know that they cannot be criminally liable for this or that act that they take in a very expansive way. Now, we'll of course see, follow litigation to more intricately spell out what qualifies as an official act and so forth. But just the conceptual framework that the court set out, I think, makes it inescapable that official actions will be an extremely capacious category. Again, perhaps even leading to any action, virtually any action that the president takes, if it intersects in some conceivable way with his official actions, could qualify. In 1974, when Gerald Ford issued the pardon to Richard Nixon after Nixon resigned, I posted this earlier today. Ford wrote in his statement announcing the pardon that the pardon was occasioned by the fact that due to certain official actions or certain acts of Nixon while in office, Nixon had become potentially liable for criminal repercussions. And that was why the pardon was issued, to immunize him totally from any of those potential criminal repercussions that he could have become subject to as a result of his actions in office. So when people try to say this always existed, you got to be specific. This always existed in practice, yes, through ad hoc stuff such as a pardon, or through again informal mores and norms and so forth. Yeah, it functionally existed, but it hadn't existed as a formal legal principle that's enforceable by law until yesterday. So again, as best you can, if that doesn't register with you, if you can't compute what I just said, just like maybe meditate for a few minutes and try to imagine a world where Trump doesn't exist, and then go and read the opinion. And I don't know how you could avoid that conclusion. So you'll see the instant partisan reaction among the Democrats was, oh, hair on fire, Trump's going to be a tyrant, and the Supreme Court is going to aid his quest for tyranny. But then you had MAGA people say, oh, this is nothing. This has always existed. Don't overreact. And I'm not going around telling anybody to light their hair on fire. I'm just saying it's an extremely consequential decision because, as the dissent points out, and I'll read a quote. Actually, I find persuasive a lot of what's written in the dissent. Obviously, the Sotomayor dissent in particular had some hysterical flourishes to it, or overwrought flourishes. But the substance of it, I'm not sure how anybody could really deny. And again, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I'm a reasonably competent adult. I'm not Joe Biden, so I can read stuff and weigh the implications. And I'm just going to give you so this is from Justice Jackson. She writes, the majority's new presidential accountability model undermines the constraints of law as a deterrent for future presidents who might otherwise abuse their power. Now, she's not referring to Trump. Maybe she's implicitly referring to Trump, but she could be referring to anybody. President Joe Schmo. How can anybody just deny that the elimination formally of criminal liability for presidential actions, a whole, expansive slew of them, removes any potential deterrent effect that might constrain a president to engage in what he might suspect or worry would result in eventual criminal liability? Again, in practice, there was already an understanding that he wouldn't face criminal liability regardless. But I'm saying now it's been formalized. Okay, so this is a formal expansion of executive power. It goes beyond Trump. I think people are well served, I would suggest, by not perpetually, always, and everywhere, 24/7, being in this Trump-centric frame of mind, because sometimes there's stuff that happens that transcends that. And especially if you, as I have, been following for when I was in college, one of the big things that I studied was this unitary executive theory that people in the George W. Bush administration were promoting to vastly expand their unilateral powers. That's largely continued unabated since then, and this is putting it on steroids, at least in certain respect. Yeah, so that's so I guess my basically conclusion there would be, for any narrow-minded partisan, try to alleviate yourself of the tedious burdens of partisan gamesmanship by just impartially, dispassionately evaluating the significance of this ruling and not immediately filtering it through the lens of pro or anti-Trump. So that's always a distortion. Okay, so I'm going to now look at some comments. I'm sure there's some stuff on the ruling that slipped my mind. Being on a team is cringe, says Drew. Yeah, this is a whole nother thing. I mean, I can't stress enough how brain melting it is. And I've been doing this for long enough now that I'm not like some seasoned, old, grizzled veteran or anything, but like long enough that I've gone through several election cycles. One where I was more like a participant, I guess you would say, in 2008. It was before I was in any kind of media or journalistic capacity. But then 2012, 2016, 2020, now 2024 in a media/journalistic capacity. And it never ceases to be maddening to me and depressing and alienating how mentally corrupted people become when they place as paramount in their own like just processing of information their partisan allegiance. That you can claim, oh, I'm pro-Trump, so we're gonna make America great again. Blah 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 blah. Okay, I get it. Let's calm down. I'm just saying that if you make your whole like information processing system organized around being pro-Trump, so every little data point that comes in, you orient around your need to be unswervingly pro-Trump, that can't not distort how you see the world. And the same for being a pro-Democrat or whatever else. So that's why I'm over time I'm more less and less interested in even really having a partisan preference. Not because I'm just an above it all centrist, or I don't want to take sides, or I want to be like Barry Weiss anti-tribal or something. But I really do find it. We talk about cognitive impairment. I do really think it's a cognitive impairment. I think it inhibits radically people's ability to rationally assess evidence and information and data before them. And for what? I mean, at least from my standpoint, is rooting for the big kingpin of the Republican Party in 2024 really that worth it to you? What do you think you're going to get, like an appointment to the White House Holocaust Commission or something? And likewise for the Biden or the Democrats. I mean, actually, what's interesting with this whole uproar around Biden now is that I go back and forth between which party is more deferential to its big leaders, but there is a serious revolt going on right now against Biden. So maybe it was just too much for them to bear finally, where it reached a breaking point. But the point is, like, don't. Far be it for me to give anyone advice, but if you think that I have enough enough legitimacy or credibility to be worth taking advice from, I would really encourage people to try to break themselves out of any kind of partisan political mentality. Doesn't mean you can't have political convictions or beliefs or even vote for a candidate, but just to kind of constantly be warped into this defensive or offensive posture based on like what news of the day is good or bad for your preferred candidate. It's like it's mind melting. I really, maybe this is like my journalistic impulse speaking to some extent. I don't expect necessarily everybody on earth or everybody in the United States or anywhere to have a similar outlook on this as the same outlook on this as me, but I'm just speaking from my own standpoint. I just can't. I just find it to be intolerable and sad. Let's see. I don't know. I can't tell if my StreamYard comments and Twitter comments are synced. I think maybe I'm also broadcasting on YouTube right now. So that could be it. I'm going to check my. Does anybody know if? So weird thing about the X setup here is that it's not like a Spaces, like an audio Spaces, where you send out the link via tweet and then can see tweet-based comments. People can only comment in the chat. Is that right? Again, I'm showing my mental dexterity by trying to learn as I go along here. Okay, well, that's enough for now, I guess. Thanks for everybody for tuning in. I'm probably eventually going to get a more professional camera set up in here and stuff. If you're interested, if that sounds appealing to you, let me know. But I really just want to give it a test run now and just ramble for a bit. And I hopefully have a piece out that I alluded to earlier on some of this more of the Biden stuff, maybe tomorrow. Okay, everybody. Good chatting with you. And I'll try to have guests and stuff maybe as we go along. Again, just testing the waters. Somebody says I look perfect and gorgeous. I agree. All right. Bye, everybody.